In this PowerPoint, we're going to look at two geographic locations in Europe from after the war. The first is in Italy and a little bit of Spain, and then we'll go up to northern Europe and look at the Netherlands and Belgium and Denmark. But I don't know, it's a strange kind of cobbling together of artists. We'll be talking about a couple of different art groups, first known as Art Informale, and then the second group known as CoBrA. But these art groups are kind of vague and squishy and wishy-washy. They don't have like set manifestos, although there is writing associated with CoBrA. It's not like they have an agenda. It's not as organized as Gutai. There's a lot of overlapping with the movement of Tashism or lyrical abstraction that we talked about with France. So it doesn't really have good, clear boundaries. And I think for that reason, it's not very well known in the United States because for whatever reason, we like in the US to have very clear movements with a beginning date and an end date, and we like to have a label that is appropriate for all the artists associated with it. So you just have to be a little bit uncomfortable with vagueness. Here, when we're talking about art informal, really it's the artists that and what they did rather than any specific movement that's important when we talk about, especially art informal, and a couple of the major artists associated with it. So I don't mean to be wishy-washy about all this, but it is just kind of vague. And we're going to talk about this relatively quickly. This will not be a very long PowerPoint. Alberto Bori is one of the most interesting and important artists of Italy from the second half of the 20th century. And he's got a very interesting story, and it relates so much to this post-war moment. He was trained as a doctor and like a medical doctor, and he served in the Italian army. And remember, they were the bad guys in World War II, along with Germany and Japan. The Italians were fighting in North Africa, and Alberto Bari was assigned to a unit there. He was captured in 1943 and sent to a prisoner of war camp in the United States. I don't know if you know this, but there were several prisoner of war camps in the United States, including here in Wisconsin. And he was sent to Texas. And while he was in Texas, he decided he was never going to practice medicine again. And this is kind of typical of war trauma. He just didn't want to deal with medicine any longer, and he decided he was going to become a painter. So he taught himself to paint, and because he didn't have access to canvases in the prisoner of war camp in Texas, he used like flour sacks, burlap sacks that had supplies in it like rice and potatoes and various things. And so that's what he used as his surface. And he painted in a realistic style. He tried to make his art as realistic as possible. After the war, he returned to Italy and just can't really resume his normal life because he's been exposed to the front and to war, and it's not going to work for him to go back to the life he had. So he continues to make art, but now he rejects painting figures, and instead he continues with this practice of using burlap sacks. And what he does is he cuts them up and he sews them together. And sometimes he adds paint and sometimes he doesn't, but he still calls these his paintings. He literally does hundreds of them in the next 5 years. From 1945 to 1950, it is like this almost therapeutic exercise for him. And he cuts out these pieces, he sews them on. In some areas, he leaves holes. In some areas, you see that he adds other things, and the stitching is different in different pieces. The sacks that he uses are not fresh sacks, but sacks that have a previous life. So they have signs of scuff marks and, stains from whatever they might have held in them, and they're kind of look dirty. And a lot of people interpret these as soldiers that he's continuing to stitch up, that he's continuing to fix their wounds, that he is on this mission to fix the world. And he doesn't like those metaphysical readings. He says that words can't express what he's doing. And that's also very typical of this generation who went to war, saw horrible things, and didn't want to talk about it. You know, the greatest generation. If you've ever paid any attention to that generation after the war, they weren't able to speak of it afterwards. And Alberto Burri is no different, but he makes art instead. Each of these is different. Each of them has different materials. They have different, like I said, stitching on them in different places. In this case, you can see that there's red underneath, those little red holes. That's red paint. And also in the upper right corner, that's gold leaf. He'll often apply a little bit of gold leaf to this. So, you know, gold leaf is usually associated with religious painting, particularly in Italy. It's associated with the Catholic Church. It's associated with icons and beautiful altar pieces inside these old churches that date back to the first days of Christianity in the Roman Empire. And so gold is this kind of religious, uplifting, holy type of material, and he's applying it to these wretched objects, these objects that are torn apart and stitched together. And there's really, you know, when you see that gold leaf, there's this kind of redemption that Burri seems to be trying to give to these objects. And in a sense, he's elevating them, even without the gold leaf, he's elevating them to works of art by making paintings like this. Here's two more. And I realized looking at them in slide form, they almost look like you're looking at a detail of a larger piece, but these are the actual pieces that they would be framed and hung on the wall. Again, on the work on the right, you can really see the layering effect. Burri also took plastic material, like industrial plastics, thick sheets, like that you might use for tarps or something else, and he would burn holes in them and stretch them onto a canvas and also layer them. And these really have a sense like they're wounds. Like in this case, he's not sewing them up though. He's just sort of leaving these wounds. And particularly when he uses this red plastic, which was his preferred color of this stuff, you have the sense that you're looking at flesh and you're looking at the degradation of a body. Here you can see he also used clear plastic, but also plastic that still had this life that was used in industrial settings. Maybe he got them from factories or discarded in dumpsters, and then he burned holes through them, and so the holes actually clarify things. You can see through this plastic now, and then they're often displayed hanging from the middle of the room so that you can walk around them and see both sides. So that's Alberto Burri. He really kind of emphasizes this idea of art Informale being kind of non-traditional materials, and of this idea of art is no longer an elevated thing, but has to reflect the world around you in a certain way. The work made by Antonio Tapias is very much in the same category as that of Alberto Burri. He's Spanish, but after the war, his work became very much about the materials of everyday life in Europe and of kind of referencing the ugliness of life, the messiness of things. There's a sense of decay. There's a sense that his works are not about the pristine, but about the damaged and about just the messiness of everyday life. He uses dirt and sand and other materials in his work. So in that case, he's like Barye in that his surfaces are stained and seem dirty. He's like Dubuffet in using different materials to get lots of different textures on his paintings. His paintings are almost like little snippets of the world. They are like uh, they're almost like walls that are dirty, like dirty city walls. Like you're walking down an alleyway, okay, and in a city, and you take a photograph of a certain area of a wall where there might be graffiti or they might have posters hanging up or something like that, just a scuffed up wall. And that's what a lot of his work looks like. He's taken a sample from just the everyday life and he's presenting it to you. Here's two more of these works by Tapias. And again, the emphasis here is that art is not elevated above the street. It's not art for art's sake, but art reflects the reality of our man-made, destructed, or not destructed, but destroyed, I guess, landscape after the war. This reflects Europe. This reflects ruins. This reflects this general sense of decay in society. Back in the United States, there's a really great photographer by the name of Aaron Siskind who was doing a similar thing with photography. He was literally walking the streets of the United States. He was in New York and photographing just portions of walls. You get a little bit of signage, you get a little bit of areas where bills are posted and been torn down and things are layered in this interesting way. So I think there's a real strong affinity between Aaron Siskind and this art of the art informal over in Europe. I don't think he knew what was going on at the time, but his work fits nicely into it. Two more Tapias works. On the right, you see something that really looks like he's painted graffiti, like he's copied graffiti from a wall on the streets of Spain or Italy, wherever he was at the time. Or on the right, a piece of canvas that looks like it is in rough shape that's been affixed to the back of a board and then painted over. And just the sense of things being scrawled on there. It's not something that requires an advanced art degree to create. There's the sense of the everyday, the common person, the common experience in all of these works. And that's kind of part of art informal, this idea of, the informal aspects of living, of that art shouldn't be about high culture. And then you have an artist like Lucio Fontana, who's part of Art Informal, but his work is very unlike the other two, and yet it's also kind of like it. He's somebody that was born in Argentina, but both his parents were Italian, and he moved back to Italy as a young child. And after the war, he began to create these compositions in which he poked holes into the surfaces of his paintings, and he called them spatial concepts because he was going beyond the flat surface of the canvas. He was breaking that seal, he was breaking that barrier. And for him, it really kind of embodied centuries of painting. Painting is an illusion that makes you believe that there's a three-dimensional reality. Traditionally, the use of linear perspective to create the illusion of depth, which is so ingrained in Italian artists going back to the Renaissance. And, even though it's 1949 by the time he does this, and there's been a lot of modern art in the past 100 years, rejecting realism and three-dimensionality, this takes it beyond that. It becomes a surface to explore space in a real way, not in a projected way, not in a fantasy of paint. And for him, he was fascinated by this idea of literally breaking on into the next realm. And so for a couple years, he explored these holes on these surfaces, and they were all part of this series that he called his spatial concepts. and he was unaware of Shimamoto over in Japan, who was also poking holes. I don't know if you remember, but they were working separately, and Lucio Fontana just kept doing it. Or Murakami, who was busting on through the stretched canvases that he had made. Again, both working without knowledge of the other. Around 1952, he took these holes and he extended them and started creating slashes on canvas, which are even more visually, I think, appealing than those holes that are poked throughout a canvas. But these slashes are aggressive and they're violent and they're evocative too. You know, they're almost like human anatomy. You know, there's just something about them, or particularly on these canvases that are done in almost skin color. There's something that makes you think of birth or life or all of these things. Multiple slashes on one canvas kind of takes that away, and so does this color, the bright color, but it's a different effect too. And then you still have this really interesting surface that nobody has ever really done before in this same way, and they're puzzling and they have a strange beauty to them. Artist is Emilio Verdova, who was also Italian and also, like Barry, completely untrained in art. Not didn't have a class, didn't come from an art background. Lucio Fontana did. In fact, his father was a well-known sculptor. But Verdova just saw some examples of lyrical abstraction and decided he wanted to paint like that. And so he's more in the camp of somebody like Georges Mathieu in France, although his work has a lot of aggressive energy that you don't often see in Europe. His probably comes closest to abstract expressionist action painting, I think, because it's not contained within the frame of the canvas. It goes over, it spills over, and there's a real aggressive energy to Verdova's work. Two more by Emilio Verdova. Again, lots of high contrast, high energy. Looks like the work on the right could be de Kooning or it could be a Michael West from the U.S. Just a lot of great contained power there. CoBrA's the other artistic avant-garde group that got together in post-war Europe, and they are associated, like I said, with Denmark, with Belgium, and with the Netherlands, but ultimately they attracted artists from all over Europe, even the United States, to their group. They too are really slippery, though. They don't really stand for any one thing, but a bunch of things. They only lasted for 3 years, but the artists that were part of CoBrA continued to make art, continued to see each other for years after that. So it becomes, slippery. Like, when do you call them CoBrA? Do you only call the work that they did for 3 years as CoBrA work and the rest is different work? In many cases, the work that they continued to do for the next 20 years looked a lot like the work that they did when they were in CoBrA. They didn't all share the same aesthetic values or aesthetic opinions about things. Their work looked different, but a lot of their work looked really similar too. So as you'll see, I mean, there's this very distinctive CoBrA look to the core members of the group. So they formed in 1948, and they published a periodical, 10 issues of it in the next 3 years. They were kind of standing in opposition to surrealism. They thought that surrealism was too cerebral, and they wanted an art that expressed spirit and expressed life, like living life. This is a little quote that comes from one of their periodicals. An image, CoBrA felt, should appear on the canvas as naturally and as quickly as a sudden change of weather in the world beyond the window, and it ought to be as impersonal as a thunderstorm. which is kind of interesting, this idea of quick naturalism. And a lot of their work does have this real sense that it was that it was done very rapidly, and yet a lot of it is not very impersonal. It seems like they're very personal in some cases. So it's just a mess of contradictions, CoBrA is. And so again, you just have to get used to it, that CoBrA doesn't really have any true meaning in terms of the group. It refers to these three cities where some of the core members were from, and maybe that's the most you can take it. But as you'll see, there was some things that they shared. They shared this love of spontaneity. They shared this fascination with children's art. Jean Dubuffet was a hero of theirs in France. He's somebody who his ideas found their way into their work. They appreciated the work not only of children, but of psychiatric patients and of untrained artists. So there was that openness to the world of the non-art specialist, which you saw a little bit of in Arte Informale also. Now, unlike Arte Informale, the artists associated with Arte Informale never said, "Hey man, I'm an Arte Informale member. What are you?" That was a label that was kind of attached to them later on to describe their work. Whereas CoBrA, they came up with that name themselves. So there is a sense of them as a group, even if there isn't a great sense of them sharing a lot of ideas. Have I confused you? I hope not, but it's kind of confusing. I just want to very quickly go through the work of the main core members first, and then talk about some other people that came and joined them as part of this group. But Asger Jorn is a big name in European art. He's not as well known in the United States. In fact, none of these artists are very well known in the United States, although that is beginning to change a little bit. And there's an article about some of them in the Canvas module here. Asger Jorn, these images are kind of typical of his work. Again, there's a childlike quality to them, a spontaneous quality, done quickly, lots of drips, lots of color, the bright colors of a child that a child might create, but they're usually a lot sloppier than children's art. If you've ever had kids or worked with kids, usually kids are a little bit less, their compositions are a little less crowded. Constant was a founding member, and he has a couple of ideas about art that I pulled out of the textbook to add to this, just to give you a sense of his approach to art. He thought that the stimulation of the creative impulse was art's main task. And really, it's kind of an important task. Like, you see this art and it makes you want to make your own art. That's important because it's this idea of art spreading through the world and art being an international kind of a peaceful agent in a way. We're still talking about the post-war period. We're talking about this need to reach out and embrace peace and embrace beauty. And so if you can look at this art and think, I want to go and paint after I finish this PowerPoint, then Constance says that's the main point of art, is to just make more art, spread the art, be an art missionary. And this idea about not making distinctions between the beautiful and the ugly is also an important part of CoBrA's identity. They don't distinguish between good art and bad art, between high art and low art, between trained art and untrained art. It's all just this creative process and a fulfillment of creative instincts, which is all a good thing in a world that is so tired of destruction. Creation is the opposite of it. Carl Appel is somebody who follows along with these ideas of Constant and Asger Jorn. Again, I think there's just something so remarkably similar in all these works. These faces, these childlike scrawls, these bright, bright colors, it kind of repeats over and over and over again. So even though they don't stand for any one set of ideas about art, they certainly share an aesthetic. At least these people do. You'll see that later on, additions to them do not. Here a painting and a sculpture. I love his sculptures, these brightly painted wooden boards. Again, you can really see the influence both of children's art, but of folk art especially. The bright, bright colors are something that you find in both. These could be like folk art dolls on the right-hand side attached to a wood. The other appeal, of course, of children and childhood is it's this, supposedly innocent time. It's a time when you can explore your creativity. It's a time in which play is encouraged. And this was a strong focus of the CoBrA group, is the idea of play, the idea of doing group activities that was fun, that was creative, that engaged these childlike instincts. And for them, again, after the ruin of Europe at the hands of adults, it was thought that being more childlike is a good thing and not a bad thing. Pierre Alechinsky, it's through action alone that the thought can intercede with matter. Like, who does that sound like? It sounds like he should be belonging to Gutai, right? This idea of, meeting your inner thinking with the matter, and action is what precipitates that. So he doesn't go to the extremes that Gutai does. Nobody really does at this point in the post-war world. But you do see very quickly done art, and doing art quickly, again, already mentioned before, but becomes something that is part of the CoBrA idea, and it's like instinctual. It's like children don't take forever to complete their works of art, right? You have them working on this painting, and they're done in, less than an hour, and it's done, and it's a masterpiece. It's this child's great creation, and they favored that type of spontaneity. It shouldn't be a surprise then that if he's insisting on action, that Pierre Alechinsky did a series of paintings that really sort of focus on this flow, this movement, kind of seem New York school in this sense here in these larger, more action-like paintings. Corneille is another artist who, like Constant, just went by a single name, and that's kind of like embracing this child idea too. Just call me Jack, just call me Ruby, whatever. The thing about the CoBrA's embrace of childhood too, that was different from the surrealist embrace of childhood, because surrealism was also interested in childhood, but surrealism was interested in childhood as a time when sexual fantasies were created with the beginnings of psychosexual development. They went beyond childhood to go to things that would erupt in adulthood, and that was not at all what CoBrA was interested in. CoBrA was interested in the kind of innocence of childhood, not in a Freudian understanding of childhood, but of just an exuberant childhood, a peaceful childhood, an idealized childhood, a romanticized childhood is really what they were about. But it's very different than surreal childhood. Corneille did a number of non-representational paintings that were abstract and kind of objective, but there's still this childlike hand. You can see the tremulous line that is very typical feature of CoBrA art. That's the shaky line that is creating things. And you see a lot of color and a lot of action, a lot of movement. Christian d'Outremont was one of the originals of CoBrA as well. In fact, he wrote the document that they all signed in 1948, saying who they were. These are a couple of his early works. He's more of a writer than a painter, and in fact, writers and poets were drawn to CoBrA, and that's who contributed to the magazine. And so it wasn't just painters, but it was writers and poets, like I said, and sculptors that came to them. So this is d'Outremont's early work, but he then married a Chinese woman and became fascinated by calligraphy. And for most of d'Outremont's rest of his career, he painted images like this that are almost like calligraphic characters that have broken loose from their function as language and become birds or abstract forms that all have the sense of movement. To me, it's almost like birds flying in a flock. A lot of his works remind me of that idea. What's more childlike than playing dress up? That's what Eugene Brand thought. And he constructed these fantastic costumes, particularly masks, that he would fabricate out of all kinds of materials, out of natural materials, out of skins, out of cardboard, out of wood, out of feathers, and create these great creatures that he would then photograph himself or others wearing the masks or wearing other features of a costuming, such as this great fingernails and clutching this tree branch in one hand. Most of these masks no longer exist. They were kind of ephemeral, meant to be worn for a little bit for some fun and then discarded or just not preserved. Some of these masks are kind of wonderfully goofy and strange. Some of them are a little bit close to ethnographic examples. So, like he looks to different non-European traditions and kind of appropriate some things. That's not super cool. For example, the work on the right, that mask hanging on the wall, looks like a Denisone false face masks, and those are very sacred to native peoples and not cool to be copying them in sort of this way. But he was a European and didn't understand appropriation really at that time. There were two major exhibitions of CoBrA while they were functioning as a group. The first was in 1949 and was in Amsterdam. And then in 1951, there was a second exhibition in Brussels, or not Brussels, but Belgium. And the second exhibition was a lot larger because it included more artists who had heard of CoBrA and who wanted to participate in an exhibition with them and who shared affinities with them. So 33 artists from 11 countries. There are probably around 40 artists that were involved with CoBrA altogether. Some say it's more than 50, but I think 40 might be a better number. Anyway, I want to look at some of these other artists that came along and became CoBrafied here in this next section. I also like the photograph on the left that shows some of CoBrA members bringing their work to the museum, and then an installation view. You can see, I think that's Asger Jorn. His work in the background, it's very large, as you can tell. Maybe it's Carol Appel. They're so similar. It's hard to tell. Herb Gentry was an American. He's a black man who served in the Army in World War II, and he was stationed in Europe. And when he came back to the United States, he asked himself, why did I come back to this country where I'm a second-class citizen, where I face racism every single day, when life was so much better for me as a black man in Europe? And he couldn't answer that question. And so he returned to Europe in 1946. And he lived there for most of the rest of his life with some extended trips back to the US. And he was very interested in the CoBrA ideas and in childhood. And these are a couple of his early works that he did associated with that group. And here are a couple more of his a little bit later works, where you've got all these faces. And again, it feels very much like something CoBrA artists would do with the movement, with the bright color, particularly the color on the right one. And he does have a lot more colorful works than I've just selected here for this brief introduction to Herb Gentry. But he's an interesting man, interesting character, and deserves to be more well known than he is. These are two paintings by Shinkichi Tajiri, who was a Japanese American. And when Pearl Harbor happened, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, the Japanese American population on the West Coast was rounded up and sent to concentration camps in the American West, and Shingichi Tajiri's family was one of these families that had their land taken away from them and ended up in a camp in Arizona. He and his brother enlisted in the army, where they fought in Europe, and then after the war, they too thought, why do we want to live in racist America? And so Shinkichi moved, and he went to the Netherlands, and again basically stayed in the Netherlands for most of his adult life, kind of abandoning the America that had treated his family so horribly. These are a couple of these childlike paintings that he does early on in his stint with CoBrA. But he ultimately is more well known as a sculptor. He did much more sculptures than he did paintings. He turned to this medium once he was in the Netherlands, and he made these kind of wonderful bronze sculptures early on. Later in his career, he'd make larger ones out of steel and out of aluminum, and they're more abstract. But these ones are almost like the little critters that pop and dance around in Constance paintings or in the paintings of Asger Jorn or Karel Appel. So these have a real affinity for those early CoBrA-like, childlike critters. A protege of Tajiri, one who he helped to understand sculpture, is a woman by the name of Ferdi. And Ferdi, this is her on the left, wearing one of her sculptures. She was a sculptor and a metalsmith. She made jewelry. She was interested in making costuming in sort of this fantastic childlike play way. But the things that she's most remembered for now, and unfortunately she died early in 1969, but she constructed these fantastic sculptures out of this industrial fake fur, and they're like furniture. They're meant to be sat upon. They're meant to be lie upon. You're supposed to lie down on them and interact with them. She christened them hortisculptures, kind of like horticulture, like they're plants, and they're often based on plant forms. And these things are these wonderful hybrid kind of, they're half furniture, they're half sculpture, they're whimsical, they're fun, they look like they stepped right out of Pee-wee's Playhouse, if you know what that is. They're just these kind of total flights of whimsy in the way that they are constructed and the way they look, and they're life size, so they have this real presence to them. This is a work titled Her Womb Tomb on the left, and it is a casket. It's a funeral casket in the shape of a womb, like you're returning to the womb. The center image is the image of Ferdi inside her womb tomb, just taking a nap, chilling. And on the image on the right, you can see the top has been taken off the bottom. So in the bottom, that's what she's lying in, and then the top, well, she's in the front, and then two friends are poking their heads out the opening there. Trippy, huh? Shinkichi Tajiri and Herb Gentry weren't the only two escaping racism of their home country. Ernest Mancoba was from South Africa, and he was escaping the bitter apartheid that had divided his country into the white ruling class and the poor, desperate black citizens of South Africa. He was able to get out, and he came to Europe, where he attempted to be a part of the CoBrA movement, but apparently there was racism even within this CoBrA movement, and Ernest Mancoba felt that he was excluded because of his race and was somewhat unhappy about it later. These are the types of works that he did in Europe. He was proud to have been affiliated with CoBrA, even though he didn't think that they treated him like they should. He He often claimed to be the only man from Africa involved in an avant-garde art movement in the 20th century in Europe. And he developed two very distinct styles of work, the colorful, more dark work that I just showed you, and then this body of work that he created where it's almost like he's looking back to early Fauve work, although not quite as colorful as the Fauves were in the 20th century, but very light colors, sort of not a very heavy application of color, and a real agitated surface. So that's going to do it for CoBrA. I could keep showing you really interesting artists that were associated with CoBrA, but then you'd have to listen to me go on. And so I'm going to stop and put an end to this PowerPoint. Thanks for listening.